A young girl walks barefoot across cool obsidian tiles, her ankles wrapped in golden bells so that every step sings softly through the grand temple hall. Her skin is dusted in sacred powders, her hair woven with hummingbird feathers polished to iridescent shine. She is only 14, yet the priests bow as she passes. Commoners avert their eyes, not in disrespect, but in fear of beholding something too holy. To them, she is not a child. She is not even human anymore. She is the living embodiment of a goddess, destined for a death more glorious and more terrifying than any mortal could imagine. Her people do not see this as cruelty. In their world, life is not a gift. It is a debt. Every birth is a loan taken from the gods, and every beating heart must one day repay its price. She was chosen not because she was weak, but because she was perfect, untouched, flawless. The kind of beauty that was believed to reflect divine essence. To sacrifice an ordinary person was obligation. To sacrifice her was honor. Yet beneath the ceremonial calm, there is tension. She walks with poise, but does she understand? Has anyone told her, in words she could truly grasp, that the radiant garments she wears are not wedding robes, but funeral attire? That the feathered cloak across her shoulders is not meant to keep her warm, but to make her resemble the god whose skin she will soon be offered in place of hers? No one knows what she thinks. No one dares to ask. She has not spoken in days, kept silent by ritual command. Some say she is already halfway between the mortal and celestial worlds. Others say she is simply too frightened to speak. Outside, the city is preparing. The sun is rising, and with it drums begin to thunder through the air like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Thousands gather at the base of the towering pyramid, not in horror, but in anticipation. Mothers lift their children onto their shoulders, whispering, "Look." That is what devotion looks like. Warriors stand in rigid silence, swallowing envy, for only the purest may die such a holy death. Even the elderly weep, not out of sadness, but longing. They wish they could trade places with her. She ascends the first step of the great temple staircase. The crowd erupts into song. It is not a dirge. It is not mourning. It is celebration. Her death will feed the sun. Her blood will keep the sky burning. Without her, the world would wither. Without sacrifice, crops would rot, rivers would dry, stars would fall. In their eyes, she is not being killed. She is becoming something greater. But what does she believe? Does she feel honored, elevated by divine purpose? Or does some primal part of her mind still scream for life? Does she look at the sky and silently beg the sun to refuse her offering? Or does she close her eyes and imagine herself awakening as a goddess on the other side? This is the contradiction at the heart of Aztec devotion. Faith and violence were not opposites, they were intertwined. Beauty was cultivated only to be destroyed. Purity was preserved only so it could be shattered at its brightest. To be worshipped meant to be doomed. To be chosen meant to be erased. And yet, even knowing this, not all resisted. Some went willingly. Some smiled as they climbed the steps. Some believed with all their hearts that a life lived in obscurity was meaningless compared to a death witnessed by tens of thousands. To modern eyes, it is madness. To theirs, it was transcendence. Today, we ask ourselves, were these girls victims or volunteers? Did they die because they were powerless, or because their society convinced them that surrender was sacred? We cannot answer. We can only watch, across 500 years of history, as the young maiden reaches the final step and turns to face the blazing sun. The priests spread their arms. The drums reach a fevered tremor. The crowd falls silent, reverent, trembling. She does not weep. She does not run. She stands still, beloved, glorified, already half immortal. And in that moment before the blade descends, time itself seems to hold its breath. The Aztec Empire was a world of contradictions, an Eden built on skulls, a civilization of artists, poets, and astronomers who believed that beauty itself could not exist without blood to sustain it. To understand why virgins were revered and then sacrificed, we must first walk through the world that shaped such devotion. At first glance, Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, looked like a paradise. Floating gardens bloomed across glittering canals. Palaces were adorned with turquoise mosaics and shimmering shells brought from distant oceans. Exotic birds with rainbow feathers soared overhead, their cries echoing across ivory courtyards. Poets recited hymns to love while artisans carved jade into delicate flowers. It was, to a Spanish conquistador's eyes, a city greater than anything in Europe. But beneath this breathtaking beauty was an unshakable certainty. The world was dying every moment, and only constant offerings could keep it alive. According to Aztec mythology, the sun was not a god who reigned effortlessly, it was a god who struggled. Every sunrise was a battle. Every sunset was a warning. The stars were the teeth of demons waiting to devour the earth if the sun ever lost its strength. Humanity's role was not passive worship. It was maintenance. To the Aztecs, the universe was a vast engine, and blood was its fuel. This belief was not symbolic. It was literal. The sun needed nourishment. The rain god needed gratitude. The earth goddess needed flesh to awaken her fertility. The gods had once sacrificed themselves to create mankind. Now mankind owed them the same sacrifice in return. In this sacred economy, nothing was free. Every blessing required payment. Every harvest had a price. Life in Aztec society reflected this cosmic duty. Children were raised not with fairy tales, but with fire and discipline. A mother might press a chilly obsidian blade against her child's chest and whisper, "This is what feeds the sun. Never forget." If a child refused to work, they might be held over burning chilly smoke to teach humility. Not as cruelty, but as preparation. Strength and obedience were virtues. Weakness was a sin. And yet, within this severity was a strange tenderness. The Aztecs saw sacrifice not as execution, but as elevation. To be chosen was not humiliation, it was promotion. Those who died on the altar were not mourned. They were celebrated. Songs were composed about them. Families who provided sacrificial victims, whether willingly or through tribute, were honored as collaborators of the gods. Even prisoners begged to be sacrificed rather than kept as slaves, for in death they would be reborn as divine warriors accompanying the sun across the sky. This belief extended deeply into gender and purity. Virgin maidens were considered the most potent vessels of spiritual energy. Untouched by desire, unstained by sin, they were living embodiments of cosmic perfection. Their bodies were not merely flesh, they were conduits. A single drop of their blood was believed to hold the power of 10 ordinary offerings. Thus, when one such maiden was selected to serve as a bride of the gods, the entire city rejoiced. She was pampered, dressed in silk-like cotton, perfumed with copal resin, and fed delicacies that even nobles seldom tasted. She walked among mortals but was already considered divine. And yet, everyone knew her fate. It is here that modern minds falter. How could a society shower someone with love only to destroy them? How could affection coexist with annihilation? But to the Aztecs, there was no contradiction. Creation and destruction were not opposites, they were twins. Just as the seed must be buried to sprout, so must purity be extinguished to unleash its full power. They believed that by killing beauty, they preserved it forever. This mindset did not emerge in isolation. It was forged through centuries of war, famine, and spiritual fear. The Aztecs were not always dominant. They had once been nomads, scorned and landless. Their rise to power came not through mercy, but through ferocity. Every surrounding nation watched them with horror and admiration. Their empire thrived not just through conquest, but through awe. They made death a spectacle. Rituals were staged not in hidden chambers, but atop pyramids towering hundreds of feet high, visible for miles. Sacrifice was theater. Devotion was performance. And the stars were the audience. In such a world, a virgin maiden was not merely a person. She was a message, a declaration, a promise to the cosmos that the Aztecs would never allow the sun to falter, never permit the universe to collapse. Her life was precious, precisely because it was destined to be surrendered. Only by understanding this can we understand what came next. For in the Aztec world, worship was never gentle. Love was never passive. And faith, Faith always demanded proof, carved in flesh. From the moment a virgin maiden was selected for sacred duty, her life ceased to belong to herself. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a child of flesh and kin. She became property of the gods, wrapped in silk, guarded like treasure, and shaped into a symbol of perfection. Some were chosen as infants, offered by noble families seeking favor. Others were tributes, gifts from conquered kingdoms, handed over as tokens of submission. A few were selected from among the commoners, discovered by priests who roamed marketplaces and festivals, silently searching for signs of divine symmetry, flawless skin, calm eyes, a presence that felt otherworldly. Beauty alone was not enough. Purity mattered more. If there was even a whisper of impropriety, if a young man had so much as glanced too long in her direction, she would be rejected. The chosen could not be touched. Not by desire, not by rumor, not even by dream. Only the untouched could touch the gods. Once taken, she was delivered to the Kalmakak, a sacred house that functioned both as sanctuary and prison. Its walls were high and windowless, its corridors silent. Here she lived among priestesses who watched her every step, every breath. She was bathed daily in scented waters, her hair combed with bone ornaments, her body anointed with oils. Meals were carefully selected to cool the blood, for passion was considered a disturbance of the soul. She was fed maize steeped in flowers, cocoa water without spice, and fruits believed to calm temptation. Every aspect of her existence was designed to preserve her untouched essence. But purity was not only physical. Her thoughts had to be disciplined as fiercely as her body. Priests visited her at dawn to recite hymns of obedience and cosmic duty. At night, she slept beneath blankets embroidered with suns and serpents, symbols of sacrifice and transformation. If she cried, no one comforted her. Tears were petty. Goddesses did not weep. If she asked questions, she was told that humans had no right to understand the plans of heaven. Her fate was not to be questioned, it was to be embraced. In rare cases, the chosen maidens were allowed to walk among the public during ceremonial events. But when they appeared, they were escorted by guards and priestesses who carried obsidian knives at their sides, not to defend her from others, but to defend her from temptation. A single misstep, a stolen kiss, a reckless touch, even accidental, would render her unfit for sacrifice. And an unfit vessel was worse than useless. It was blasphemous. Some maidens who broke their vows were not punished with mere shame. They were executed instantly, not as sacrifice but as waste. It is easy to imagine these young girls as helpless prisoners, but the truth is more complex. Some obeyed out of fear, others out of indoctrination, but a surprising number embraced their role with pride. From birth, Aztec children were taught that ordinary death was meaningless. To die of old age was to fade into obscurity. But to die for the gods, that was glory. Some maidens would whisper to each other in the dark, not of escape but of destiny. They believed that upon death, they would join the sun as radiant spirits. They would travel the sky for 4 years, then return as hummingbirds, feeding on the nectar of flowers placed at the altars built in their honor. Still, not all believed so easily. Some lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, wondering if divinity was worth dying for. Did they secretly wish to run? Did they ever look at the guards by the door and imagine pushing past them? We will never know. Their voices are lost. Their diaries were never written. Their thoughts were not preserved, only their silence. Months before the final ceremony, the maiden's transformation intensified. Her hair was cut to shoulder length, a symbol of detachment from earthly identity. She was dressed in garments modeled after the goddess she would be married to. If she was chosen for Totec, she wore gold bands and red paint. If for Tlaloc, she bore turquoise beads and jade tears upon her cheeks. She rehearsed sacred dances, not for entertainment but as rituals of imitation. In these final days, she ceased to be an individual. She became a living embodiment of myth. And through all this, one rule remained absolute: she must never be alone. A goddess does not wander. A goddess does not hesitate. A goddess does not remember she was ever human. Thus she waited, not for rescue, not for rebellion, but for ascension. for soon she would no longer walk among mortals. She would be carried to the altar, and there, her final role would begin. She was not simply led to her death, she was escorted to her wedding. To the Aztecs, sacrifice was not the end of life. It was a marriage, a union between mortal flesh and divine power. When the chosen maiden reached her final days, she was no longer addressed by her birth name. She was called by the name of the god she now represented. Xilanen if she belonged to the corn goddess, Zakiquetzal if she was to embody beauty and fertility, Tlaloc's bride if she had been reserved for the rain god. She was no longer seen as herself. She was already becoming deity. The preparations were elaborate, theatrical, and deeply symbolic. 4 days leading up to the sacrifice, she was adorned as a bride in flowing garments woven with quetzal feathers and gold threads. Her skin was painted with sacred dyes, turquoise, red ochre, white chalk, each marking a trait of the god she now mirrored. Sometimes, golden lip plugs or jeweled ear spools were placed upon her, not as ornaments but as ceremonial seals, declaring that no mortal mouth or ear could receive human speech anymore. She would speak only to the gods. Her hair was braided with flowers. Bells were fastened to her ankles so that every movement jingled like music. She walked not as a condemned soul but as royalty, as if her steps were floating across a world already beneath her. The priests walked beside her, not as executioners, but as groomsmen. Then came the moment of ritual marriage. In front of the gathered crowd, she was seated beside a ceremonial idol of the god she represented. Offerings of cacao beans, copal incense, and feathers were placed before her as if customers presenting gifts to win favor from a new queen. In some cases, a high-ranking priest would symbolically take her hand, not as a lover but as an intermediary for the deity. There were songs, slow, mournful, yet strangely tender. They described her as the flower that blooms only to ascend in flame. She was praised for her beauty, her devotion, her purity. But beneath that reverence was something darker, desire. Not bodily, but spiritual. To the people, she was no longer human. She was sacred, untouchable. Yet they watched her with hunger, not for her flesh, but for her sacrifice. They wanted to see her ascend. They wanted to witness the union of human and divine. They wanted confirmation that the gods were still listening. There were moments of eerie stillness. She would be offered bowls of cacao and corn gruel sweetened with honey, the final meal of the divine. In some ceremonies, she laughed and danced with the priestesses, performing her role as a joyful bride. In others, she walked silently, eyes lowered, her hands trembling as she held bouquets of marigolds or stalks of maize, the last gifts she would carry as a living being. Then came the night before the sacrifice, when she would spend time alone in a secluded chamber. Some believed she was communing with the gods. Others whispered that she was allowed one final moment of private humanity, time to cry, to pray, or to accept. Whether she knelt in peace or curled in terror, no one would ever know. The chamber had no witnesses. But at dawn, the illusion broke. She emerged not as a girl, not even as a bride. She emerged as an offering ready to be claimed. The priests greeted her with firm ceremony. They placed a headdress of paper banners upon her head, each strip symbolizing her soul reaching toward the heavens. They fastened her wrists, not with rope, but with garlands of flowers, binding her softly, as if restraint could be gentle. Some maidens smiled as they stepped forward. Others trembled. Some walked with pride, believing with absolute certainty that they would awaken among the gods. Others walked because there was no other path. But they all walked. Across the courtyard. Toward the great temple steps. Their wedding procession complete. Their bridal feast digested. And now, before thousands of breathless witnesses, they went to meet their husband, their god, their final destiny. Not in a bed of silk, but on a stone altar, where love and death became one. The morning sun blazed like molten gold across the white limestone of the temple steps as the maiden began her final ascent. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. Nobles in jaguar pelts and feathered headdresses stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers and merchants. Even children were present, not shielded from death, but taught to witness it. This was not horror. This was duty. This was survival. Drums thundered through the air, slow and rhythmic, echoing the heartbeat of the earth itself. Shell trumpets wailed like wind over a mountaintop. Beneath the towering pyramid, thousands knelt, chanting prayers in unison. Above them, priests stood waiting in crimson and obsidian robes, their hair matted with coagulated blood from previous offerings. Each held tools of divinity, obsidian knives sharper than steel, wooden staffs carved with sun symbols, bowls ready to collect the sacred flow of life. The maiden walked barefoot, escorted by 4 attendants who held her arms, not to restrain her, but to steady her. The bells at her ankles tinkled softly with every step, a fragile melody against the booming drums. She kept her eyes fixed ahead. She was no longer expected to look back. Below, mothers whispered to their daughters, "See how she walks. Like a goddess." But gods did not breathe so heavily. Their hands did not tremble. As she reached the summit platform, the noise below faded into a distant hum. The air was thinner here, colder. The sky so close it felt like a ceiling pressing down upon her. Before her stood the stone slab, darkened by countless stains, smoothed by countless bodies. At its head awaited the Tenochtitlan, the high priest of sacrifice, cloaked in flayed human skin, its face draped over his like a grotesque second mask. His movements were serene, almost tender. He spread his arms in greeting as though welcoming a bride to her home. The maiden was laid on her back upon the altar. Her wrists and ankles were held down by 4 assisting priests, each representing one of the cardinal directions. She did not scream. She did not resist. She stared upward at the sky, where the sun burned like an all-seeing eye. Some said that at this moment, the maiden was granted visions, glimpses of the divine realm she was about to join. Others believed she saw nothing but blinding light. The Tenochtitlan raised his hands to the sky, presenting the obsidian blade to the sun. The crowd below fell into utter silence. No breath. No movement. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then, swift as a lightning strike, the blade plunged into her chest. There was no hesitation. No ceremony in that instant. Only precision. The priest cut through flesh and bone with practiced ease, reaching beneath ribs to grasp the still-beating heart. It was lifted high into the air, steaming in the cold morning breeze. A cheer erupted, not wild but reverent. Thousands of voices cried out the name of the god being honored. Some wept with joy. Others pounded their fists against their chests in rhythm with the dying heartbeat above. Her blood cascaded down the steps in rivulets, painting the stone with shimmering crimson. For the Aztecs, each drop was sacred. Women knelt to touch the blood, pressing stained fingers to their foreheads in blessing. Warriors caught it in gourds to smear across their weapons. Farmers prayed it would seep into the soil and bring fertile harvests. But her offering did not end with her heartbeat. Depending on the ritual, her body was treated in different ways. If she had represented Totec, the god of renewal, her skin would be carefully removed and worn by the priest like the husk of corn peeled from its kernel. He would walk the city draped in her flesh, symbolizing rebirth. If she had been a bride of Tlaloc, her body might be thrown into a sacred pool so that the god of rain could claim her in the depths. If she had embodied Xochiquetzal, goddess of beauty, her limbs might be buried in flower fields so that blossoms could spring from her remains. Every action had purpose. Every cut had meaning. To us it is grisly. To them it was exquisite, the highest form of devotion. And in that moment, as the priest held her heart aloft for the sun to feast upon, the people below did not see death. They saw sunrise. The world had been fed. The gods were satisfied. And somewhere, beyond mortal eyes, they believed she was smiling, reborn in radiance. The ritual did not end when the heart stopped beating. In fact, the sacrifice was only the beginning of a far greater transformation, not just for the maiden, but for everyone who witnessed her death. Her body, her blood, even the very air she breathed in her final moment, all of it was now considered infused with Teotl, divine energy. The Aztecs believed that when a human was sacrificed, their essence did not vanish. It dispersed into earth, sky, rain, wind, crops, people. The gods consumed the offering, yes, but in doing so, They returned it to the world in countless unseen ways. This is what made Aztec sacrifice fundamentally different from mere execution. It was not about removal. It was about redistribution. Her life was not taken. It was recycled. Once the heart had been offered and the body ritually processed, the next phase unfolded, the feast of the divine flesh. Depending on the deity she represented, different groups would receive parts of her not as meat, but as communion. Flesh roasted with sacred maize. Blood mixed into chocolate drinks. Bones ground into powder and stirred into healing salves. These acts were not seen as cannibalism. They were sacrament. To ingest the flesh of a chosen maiden was to ingest the god she had become. It was believed to grant vitality, courage, fertility, or even prophetic dreams. The most privileged recipients were warriors who had earned honor in battle. To them, such flesh was not food, it was fuel. Consuming it meant consuming divinity itself. Priests recited chants as they distributed portions, warning that only those whose spirits were pure could digest sacred power without being destroyed by it. To eat was to accept responsibility. To swallow was to vow allegiance, not just to the gods, but to the cycle that demanded more offerings in the future. But not all sacrifices ended in feasting. In some ceremonies, especially those dedicated to agricultural renewal, the maiden's remains were buried beneath fields or scattered across water. Farmers would plant seeds directly into blood-soaked soil, believing that future crops would carry her spirit within them. When the corn sprouted tall and golden, people did not simply thank the gods, they thanked her. Mothers would point to the swaying stalks and tell their children, "See how she grows again." In their minds, she had not died. She had multiplied. Even the tools used in her death held sacred status. The obsidian knife was placed in a temple chamber to cool, as if it, too, had absorbed excess divinity. The garments she had worn were burned in incense smoke, their ashes collected and stored as tokens of protection. Everything she touched became relic. Nothing was wasted. Nothing discarded. And then came the final layer, the transformation of memory. Songs were composed recounting her beauty and her devotion. Dancers reenacted her journey up the temple steps. Children painted murals of her spirit returning as a hummingbird or butterfly. Her name, if spoken at all, was no longer spoken with sadness. It was spoken like a prayer. Some families of sacrificed maidens even gained new status in society. They became known not as victims' kin, but as contributors to cosmic balance. Entire bloodlines were revered because one of their daughters had married the gods. To outsiders, all of this seems unthinkable. We see horror. They saw harmony. Where we see a life stolen, they saw a life expanded. But beneath all the doctrine and ritual, there remained a silent question, one that no priest ever spoke aloud. Did she truly ascend? Did her spirit really soar across the sky, joining the radiant procession of the sun? Or did she vanish, her sacrifice remembered only through songs written by others? The Aztecs chose to believe the former. They had to. Without faith, the ritual would crumble into butchery. Without belief, the blade would lose meaning. And so they believed, fiercely, desperately, that every maiden who fell upon the altar did not vanish into death. She became the wind brushing across the flower fields. She became the rain streaking down temple walls. She became the heartbeat within every living thing sustained by her offering. To them, she was not gone. She was everywhere. She had expected the chamber to be colder. In her mind, sacred places were always carved from silence and frost, hollowed into stillness where voices dared not rise above whispers. Yet as she was escorted down the curving passage into the inner sanctum, she felt not chill but warmth, a steady, pulsing heat that clung to her skin like breath. It radiated from the walls themselves, as though the stone remembered every ritual that had ever been performed within it. She could almost hear echoes trapped in the grain of the rock, faint cries, soft chanting, laughter, prayers, all layered atop one another in a tapestry of memory. The air tasted of resin and crushed petals, smoke and salt. A place not merely of worship, but of transformation. She walked barefoot across the polished floor, her steps guided not by force but by expectation. No chains bound her wrists. No blades pressed against her back. She was not being dragged, she was being delivered. That realization rooted itself in her chest like a cold bloom. She could not decide whether it made everything more bearable or far worse. The priest leading her did not look back. His movement was slow, fluid, measured, not like a man walking, but like part of the chamber's mechanism, fulfilling its eternal design. His robes shimmered as he moved, each fold catching the torchlight as though dipped in molten metal. The fabric whispered across the floor in delicate strokes, making no sound that could be called footsteps. He could have been floating. He could have been dead. She found herself matching his pace unconsciously, her breathing syncing with his rhythm. It was easier to surrender to imitation than to resist. The corridor opened gradually, the ceiling rising, the walls bending outward, until at last they emerged into the sanctum. It was vast, yet enclosed, like stepping inside the ribcage of some ancient slumbering beast. Enormous columns spiraled upward like petrified trees, their surfaces carved with spirals of animals and stars, serpents winding through celestial bands, humans kneeling beneath flames, hands raised toward circles of radiance. At the center lay a shallow pool of dark water, perfectly still, reflecting the ceiling above with mirror clarity. Dozens of oil lamps floated along its surface, their flames swaying gently without wind. Around the water, women knelt in rows, heads bowed, arms folded across their chests. Their garments were the color of moonlight, pale, nearly translucent, clinging to their skin as if born from it. They did not look up as she entered. They did not breathe loudly enough to be heard. They could have been statues, carved from quiet compliance. The priest stopped at the water's edge and turned to her at last. His eyes were unreadable, not cruel, not kind, not curious. He did not see her as one sees a person. He saw her as one sees an answer. A bowl was placed in his hands by an attendant she had not noticed. It was wide and shallow, carved from obsidian, its inner surface shimmering like captured night. Within it lay a thick amber liquid that released tendrils of steam into the warm air. The scent was intoxicating, sweet yet bitter, floral yet metallic. He lifted the bowl with slow reverence, then tilted it toward her lips. She hesitated only for a breath. Refusal was not an option, not because she feared punishment, but because she sensed that refusal would shatter something sacred within the moment. There was a script being followed, and she was dangerously aware that she had been written into it. So she parted her lips and drank. The liquid rolled across her tongue like warm honey, thick and slow, coating her throat in gold. Beneath the sweetness lurked something sharp, a bite of spice, a hint of iron, like the ghost of blood hidden within wine. It slid down into her chest and bloomed there, radiant. Heat spread outward from her core in ripples, washing through her limbs, rising to her cheeks, curling into her fingertips. The chamber dimmed and brightened at once. Sound seemed to stretch, elongating like silk pulled between hands. She felt her heartbeat slow, not from calm, but from expansion, as if her chest had grown wider to make room for it. The priest stepped back, bowl empty, and lowered his head. It was not a gesture of dominance nor blessing. It was acknowledgement, confirmation that she had crossed a threshold. Hands touched her shoulders, light, cautious, almost reverent. Two of the kneeling women had risen and approached her without sound. They guided her gently, turning her toward the pool. The water shimmered, stretching before her like a night sky fallen to earth. She could see her reflection, though it wavered softly in the lamplight. She looked both herself and not herself, her features blurred into something ceremonial. She stepped closer, the warm stone beneath her feet giving way to cool liquid as she descended the shallow steps into the pool. The water embraced her calves, then her thighs, then her waist. It was not cold as she expected. It was body warm, as though it held its own pulse. The attendants followed her in, stopping at her sides. The priest lifted his hands and spoke a word she did not know, not harsh, not gentle, but heavy with age. And then the women began to sing. Their voices were soft, breathy, floating across the water like mist. The melody had no sharp edges, no rhythm that could be followed. It was more like wind whispering through reeds, like an echo of a lullaby remembered from childhood but never fully known. The The sound did not command emotion. It drew it out. She closed her eyes. Her limbs loosened. She felt something inside her unraveling, not breaking, but unfolding. The water lapped at her ribs, her collarbone, her throat. Fingers brushed her skin, not invasive, not claiming, but guiding. They moved slowly, drawing symbols across her shoulder blades, her stomach, her wrists. Each touch left a trail of sensation that lingered, glowing beneath her skin like embers. She did not know how long she stood there. Time had dissolved into sensation, memory, surrender. The song wove around her, through her, until she could not tell if she was hearing it or dreaming it. Images rose in her mind, unbidden. A field of wheat swaying beneath a blazing sun, a child's hand gripping hers, firelight dancing on stone walls, the taste of smoke, the sound of rain against clay roofs. Memories both hers and not hers. Lives lived or imagined. She could no longer tell. Tears slid down her cheeks without pain. They fell into the water silently, vanishing without ripple. The singing softened, then ceased. The hands withdrew. She opened her eyes. The water around her glowed faintly, as though lit from below. Her skin shimmered, slick with oil and reflection. She lifted her hands and saw that they trembled, not from fear, but from fullness. She did not feel empty anymore. She felt rewritten. The priest stepped forward once more, raising his palms. The kneeling women bowed. The lamps flickered. And then he spoke, not to her, but about her. His voice was not loud, but it carried without effort, echoing off the carved walls, traveling up to the vaulted ceiling. He recited words in a tongue she did not know, yet somehow understood in feeling if not in meaning. He spoke of journeys taken and journeys completed, of vessels willing and vessels chosen. He declared her sanctified, not for destruction, not for exile, not for death, but for embodiment. She understood then that this was never meant to be an ending. It was an inauguration. She was no longer being prepared for sacrifice. She was being prepared for remembrance. The attendants guided her out of the water, lifting the cloth that had once bound her and replacing it with a new one, softer, lighter, embroidered with patterns that shimmered like shifting constellations. It rested not upon her body like a constraint but like acknowledgement. She was no longer being displayed. She was being adorned. The women resumed their positions. The priest lowered his hands. And all at once, the sanctum fell into a silence so pure it felt holy. She stood at the edge of the pool, water trailing down her skin in silver rivers. She no longer trembled. For the first time since entering, she understood her role. She was not prey. She was not pawn. She was relic, living, breathing, and forever marked. And in that moment, for reasons she could not name, she felt not fear. She felt inevitability. The first lesson every new woman in the harem learned was silence. Not just the silence of speech, but of thought, of memory, of identity. A silence so deep that even one's heartbeat began to feel too loud. When the heavy curtains were drawn behind you for the first time, there was no dramatic declaration that you now belonged to someone else, no chains clasped, no loud proclamations. Instead, the reality seeped into your bones slowly, like ink in water. You were not a prisoner in the traditional sense. You were dressed in silk, fed sweet dates and figs, allowed to walk on carpets softer than clouds. But freedom is not measured in comfort. It is measured in choice, and choice was the first luxury stripped from you. You were not allowed to ask questions. Instead, you watched. You mimicked. You survived. The older women, the ones who had been inside these walls long before you, did not greet you with warmth. They did not see a sister or a friend. They saw a future rival. They saw someone whose beauty, youth, or charm could one day shift the balance of the invisible hierarchy they had spent years clawing their way through. So they did not welcome you. They weighed you. Within the first week, you learned that the harem was not a sanctuary of luxury, as poets and outsiders imagined. It was a battlefield. But here, no one bled outwardly. The weapons were not swords or daggers but whispers, glances, rumors, and stolen moments of favor. Every woman here was both victim and hunter. They had all been taken from their old lives, some from poor villages, others from noble families, A few even captured in war, but once inside, every past was erased. You were not daughters, sisters, or wives anymore. You were possibilities. And possibilities were dangerous. Each morning began with inspections, not of attire, but of mood. A single misstep could brand you as either weak or arrogant. Too withdrawn? You were labeled boring, unworthy of attention. Too cheerful? You were marked as a threat. There was no correct way to exist, only ways to delay disaster. Meals were eaten in near silence, the clinking of silver bowls echoing like tiny bells of tension. No one reached for fruit or bread too eagerly, for greed could be interpreted as ambition. No one ate too little, for restraint could be mistaken for pride. Every movement was calculated. You wore your expression like armor. And then there were the nights. The most terrifying thing was not being summoned, it was not being summoned. Because invisibility was worse than being objectified. If the master, the king, sultan, pharaoh, emperor, whatever title he bore, forgot you existed, then your life within those walls became slow suffocation. You would be dressed and prepared every night just in case. Bathed in rosewater, hair oiled, skin perfumed, lips stained with crushed berries. And you would wait. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes until dawn. Watching as one by one, others were taken, chosen, while you were left in the cold shadow of rejection. But being chosen was not a victory either. For the moment a woman earned a night of favor, she painted a target on her own back. The others watched her with venomous eyes the next morning. They whispered. They plotted. And sometimes, strange things happened. Perfume bottles were found shattered on the floor. Belts or sashes suddenly disappeared. A cup of wine tasted slightly different, too sweet, too bitter. You never knew if the woman who braided your hair was weaving kindness or betrayal into each knot. The true torment was psychological. Days did not exist here, only cycles of anticipation and dread. You were constantly observed. Not just by other women, but by eunuchs, men stripped of manhood, forced into servitude, yet wielding immense power through access. They moved silently through corridors, eyes always watching, faces unreadable. You never knew whether they were protectors or informants. Sometimes, you would catch one looking at you with pity. Other times, with contempt. Even sleeping was a danger. Dreams became treacherous, memories of home, of family, of laughter. You would wake up with tears on your face and immediately wipe them, terrified someone might have seen. Weakness was not allowed. Emotion was exploitable. If others knew what, or who, you missed, they could use it against you. So you learned to kill nostalgia. To bury every piece of your past so deeply that not even your reflection could dig it up. The mirrors within the harem were made of polished bronze, imperfect, warped. When you looked into them, you saw a version of yourself that was almost you, but not quite. And slowly, that distorted reflection began to feel more real than the memory of your former self. Some women adapted quickly. They became manipulators, smiling when necessary, crying on command, feigning friendship only to extract secrets. They learned the language of survival, a language of half-truths and strategic vulnerability. They played roles so well that even they forgot where the performance ended and their true selves began. Others resisted. They tried to remain kind, honest, loyal. Those were the ones who suffered most. They trusted too easily. They believed in companionship. But loyalty within the harem was never permanent. It was a coin constantly traded for opportunity. One day you shared bread with someone, the next she was whispering in the ear of a higher-ranked woman that she saw you crying after dark. A sign of instability, she would say. A liability. There were no rules written on paper. No laws dictating behavior. And yet, every woman instinctively understood the unspoken commandments. Do not be too visible. Do not be too invisible. Do not be too eager. Do not be too indifferent. Do not love. Do not hate. Do not trust. Do not despair. Above all, do not forget why you are here. That last one was the hardest. Because no one really knew why they were here. Some told themselves they could rise, become the favorite, perhaps even bear a child of royal blood. Others told themselves survival alone was victory. A few clung to hope of escape, though none could name a woman who had ever left willingly. Time inside the harem was elastic. Seasons passed without being felt. The outside world became folklore. Sometimes you would hear faint music from a distant festival beyond the palace walls, or the muffled roar of a crowd during a public execution. These sounds were reminders that life existed somewhere else, somewhere you no longer belonged. But the most cruel manipulation was not inflicted by others. It was internal. Over time, you began to question your own instincts. You stopped reacting naturally. Every smile, every word, every step became a calculation. You would lie awake at night reviewing your actions from the day, wondering if laughing too loudly at a joke might have made someone jealous. Wondering if speaking too softly might have made you forgettable. You stopped being a person. You became a strategy. And one day, without realizing it, you woke up and did not remember your own real voice. You could mimic any tone, seductive, submissive, cheerful, concerned, but your true tone was gone. You lost track of your favorite food, your favorite color, your childhood memories. They had no relevance here. They offered no advantage. So your mind discarded them like unnecessary baggage. Control was not maintained through force. It was maintained through confusion, through constant shifting of expectations. One day, modesty was rewarded. The next, boldness. One day, meekness earned sympathy. The next, scorn. You could never predict what was desired, and so you learned not to desire anything yourself. A peculiar thing happened to women who stayed in the harem long enough. They forgot how to look directly at things. Their gazes drifted slightly away, never fully meeting another's eyes. As though afraid that true eye contact might reveal too much, or worse, reflect something they didn't want to see in themselves. The cruelest irony was that every woman here believed she was alone, yet all suffered the same silent torment. But unity was impossible. The structure was designed to prevent it. If women stood together, they could rebel. So instead, they were pitted against each other, forced to compete for affection from the one man who held their fates in his hands. Love, or the illusion of it, became a weapon. And sometimes, in the rare moments when the harem fell quiet, when candles flickered low and footsteps ceased, you could hear something faint. A soft exhale. A shudder. Someone crying, but too quietly for anyone to respond. Not because they were forbidden, but because responding meant acknowledging vulnerability, and vulnerability was contagious. No one dared to feel too deeply. Feelings were cracks, and cracks could be split wide open. There were legends whispered in hushed voices. Stories of women who had risen above the others, becoming queens, mothers of heirs, rulers behind the throne. But those stories were dangerous. Hope was the most volatile element in the harem. Too much of it and you became reckless. Too little and you ceased to exist. So the mind invented balance. You allowed yourself to daydream, but only in fragments. You imagined walking barefoot on grass again, but not too long. You imagined hearing your mother's voice, but not too clearly. You kept your dreams like candles, small, flickering, hidden beneath your ribs, protected from the drafts of reality. But sometimes the flame went out. And when it did, a woman became a ghost long before her body died. She moved through the corridors without weight, without urgency. She no longer competed, no longer spoke, no longer cared. And that was when the others feared her most. For a person who has nothing left to lose is unpredictable. The harem did not simply imprison bodies, it reshaped souls. It molded women into archetypes: the seducer, the schemer, the martyr, the loyalist, the traitor. But beneath each role was the same truth: every one of them had once been just a girl. A girl who had laughed freely, who had spoken without thinking, who had trusted without hesitation. A girl who had no idea that one day, her greatest accomplishment would be surviving another sunrise behind silk curtains. She stood at the edge of the chamber, the candles flickering softly across the polished stone, their light dancing on her skin as though acknowledging a new authority she herself had only just begun to understand. For years, she had walked the corridors as if invisible, her voice swallowed by shadows, her presence measured and monitored. Every smile, every tear, every whispered secret had been a weapon wielded by others against her. And yet, in the depths of that long, relentless trial, she had learned the language of control. She had learned to bend the currents of the harem to her will, not by force, but by precision. Where others had struck blindly, she now struck with calculated subtlety. She had become something more dangerous than any rival, more untouchable than any guard. Her rise had been imperceptible at first. A word here, a glance there, a subtle gesture that meant nothing to the untrained eye but spoke volumes to those attuned to the intricate web of power that held the harem together. She noticed the patterns that others missed, which women feared their shadows, which girls coveted attention, which eunuchs could be swayed with a whispered half-truth. She began to move pieces across this invisible chessboard, unseen yet omnipresent. A favor granted, a complaint ignored, a secret shared with the right confidant. Each action laid a stone in the foundation of her emerging dominion. She watched her rivals carefully, recording their weaknesses with a meticulous patience that bordered on obsession. One woman, radiant and naive, still believed loyalty could protect her. Another, cunning and outwardly aloof, misjudged the subtleties of silent observation. The eunuchs, accustomed to their own power, underestimated her entirely, seeing only the surface of compliance, the reflection of a girl who had once been broken. And yet, beneath the silk and perfume, she had become something else. A strategist, a silent puppeteer whose strings reached into every corner of the harem, pulling, nudging, testing. Every reaction, every sigh, every smile she observed became data, fuel for her growing influence. Her methods were imperceptible, almost invisible. A soft word here, a quiet correction there, always wrapped in seeming innocence. She learned to turn the fears of the others to her advantage, exploiting the slightest insecurities, planting doubts in minds already fragile from years of confinement. Rivalries were ignited without a word, alliances formed and broken by mere implication. She never raised her voice, never allowed her temper to betray her hand. The women believed she was still a girl who had endured and survived, but survival had evolved into mastery. She had learned the art of moving through the shadows without casting one herself, of becoming the pulse beneath the harem's surface. There were nights when she walked the halls alone, the torchlight reflecting off the polished tiles, illuminating the silent witnesses of her rise. Statues, columns, and mirrors watched her as if acknowledging her newfound presence. The same chambers that had once suffocated her now hummed with her dominion. She had memorized every nook, every corridor, every hidden alcove where secrets could be stored, where whispers could be exchanged. She knew which windows overlooked courtyards where no one walked, which doors led to private chambers, which corners were favored by spies and eavesdroppers. The palace itself became an extension of her will, and she moved through it like a shadow that belonged to no one but itself. The transformation was not merely strategic, it was psychological. She had discarded the fear that once governed her body, replacing it with a serene vigilance that kept every observer off balance. The women who had once tormented her now hesitated, uncertain of her intentions, unsure of the unseen calculations behind every glance. And the eunuchs, who had believed themselves untouchable intermediaries between her and power, began to treat her with a cautious respect that they could neither define nor explain. The air around her seemed charged with a quiet authority, one that demanded attention without ever issuing a command. Her first victories were subtle. A favor that seemed innocuous, a token of advice whispered to a favored companion, guiding her loyalty toward someone who would unknowingly become an ally. A small omission, a secret left unshared, leading a rival into a misstep. Slowly, the balance of influence shifted, almost imperceptibly, until she could see it in the trembling hesitation of those who once believed themselves untouchable. Every movement, every word, every shadow became part of her expanding web. The harem had been a battlefield, and she had learned not to fight with blunt weapons but with foresight, patience, and perception. The tides of power bent to her touch without her lifting a hand. Yet mastery came with its own loneliness. The empathy she had once carried was dulled by necessity. Compassion could be exploited. She no longer laughed freely, no longer allowed her guard to slip. She maintained a mask of gentle compliance, an outward appearance of serenity that concealed the calculating mind beneath. To reveal even a hint of desire, resentment, or ambition would compromise her. To trust anyone entirely was to invite destruction. And so she became a study in paradox, visible yet unseen, compliant yet commanding, gentle yet unyielding. Her presence inspired both envy and fear, though neither could quite name the source. The most dangerous aspect of her rise was subtlety. Unlike those who wielded obvious power, the favorites, the pampered, the openly dominant, she operated beneath the surface. Influence was whispered, authority implied, loyalty cultivated without overt displays. A glance here, a nod there, a carefully timed word of encouragement or warning, each action shaped the outcomes around her. She never needed to confront rivals directly. Their own ambitions, insecurities, and fears did her work for her. She became a force that existed not in confrontation, but in the shifting patterns of the harem itself. The palace responded to her as though she were part of its architecture, as if every door, corridor, and mirror recognized her as essential to its order. There were those who tried to challenge her, misjudging her quiet confidence for weakness. They sought to expose her, to manipulate her, to outmaneuver her with the very tools she had once been taught to fear. And yet she had anticipated them. Their attempts were met with calm patience, their strategies reversed or deflected through the precise deployment of information, suggestion, and subtle redirection. By the time they realized the extent of her influence, it was too late. The seeds of her ascendancy had already taken root, and the very mechanisms of the harem served her unknowingly. Rivals who thought themselves masters of intrigue discovered that she had already orchestrated their downfall through careful observation and subtle orchestration. She also learned the importance of patience. Unlike the impulsive, the greedy, or the desperate, she did not act for immediate gain. She allowed events to unfold naturally, nudging outcomes ever so slightly toward her advantage. Favor was won not through force, but through calculated appearances of loyalty and subservience. Threats were neutralized without confrontation. Alliances were cultivated invisibly, secured through unspoken understanding. She became the silent current beneath the harem, moving unnoticed yet shaping the flow of power with every measured breath. And as her dominion solidified, she began to understand a deeper truth. The harem was not merely a place of confinement or competition. It was a living organism, a web of desires, fears, secrets, and ambitions. And she had become its central pulse. Women who had once laughed, whispered, and plotted against her now deferred subtly to her counsel, followed her gaze, and heeded the softest suggestion she allowed to fall from her lips. Even the eunuchs, once untouchable and impervious, adjusted their routines to accommodate the imperceptible shifts she orchestrated. The harem bent to her, not because she demanded it, but because she had learned to move within it as though it were an extension of herself. Her transformation was complete. She no longer feared the walls that had once imprisoned her. She had become part of their structure. Every room, every corner, every shadow belonged to her in a way that no one could contest. Her voice, once silenced, was now felt in the hushed compliance of the women around her. Her gaze, once avoided, now commanded attention even without intention. She had transcended the role of captive or pawn. She had become an unseen monarch, a force whose influence rippled outward invisibly, reshaping the delicate balance of power that had once sought to crush her. And yet there was no triumph in the conventional sense. No cheers, no public accolades, no celebration of victory. Her reign was silent, unseen, absolute. Power, she realized, was not in being noticed, it was in being indispensable, in moving through the system so seamlessly that the system itself seemed to bend to your will. She had survived. She had mastered. And in mastering, she had become untouchable. At night, she would walk the corridors alone, past the sleeping women and eunuchs, past the gilded mirrors and flickering lamps, feeling the pulse of the harem beneath her feet. She could hear it in the hush of the rooms, in the faint echo of whispered conversations, in the subtle shiver of anticipation that ran through those who sensed her presence without ever seeing her move. It was a quiet, perfect authority, one that required no force, no threat, no violence. It was complete. She understood now that she had become what the harem had always demanded: a master of observation, a ruler of perception, a sovereign of silence. No one could break her, for she had learned to wield the very instruments of control that had once bound her. She was not merely a survivor. She was the harem incarnate, its unseen pulse, its quiet sovereign, its ultimate arbiter. And in that still, eternal night, she smiled, softly, imperceptibly, and without fear, knowing she was finally untouchable, powerful in ways the walls themselves could not contain.